start off by looking at these protests. How do you think this will reshape the presidential race? Steve, let's start with you.
Well, I think that when Donald Trump came in, he presided over a politics of division, and he continues to deliver on that. I don't think anything has changed at all, to be honest, other than the fact that what he talked about when he was inaugurated has become very much the vision that he continues to go down. And so people have a stark choice between trying to choose a politics where Americans hang together and come together and solve big problems and try to reach across different ethnic and economic corners. Not to say we've ever done that well, but at least there's been the aspiration of that. But Donald Trump has dropped the aspiration of that and continues to animate a politics of great divisiveness. So yes, that's what the election will be about, but that's what it was about 4 years ago as well.
Andy, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I don't disagree with Steve. I mean, I agree with that. On the other hand, elections are usually determined by, it's an old saw, but by economics or wars. In other words, if you have a bad economy, that's obviously bad for the incumbent. If you've got a war that's going badly, in particular, that's bad for the incumbent. We don't have either of those per se, although I guess you could argue that what's going on in the country sort of constitutes a war, again, sort of to Steve's point. And then also you could argue that what's going on in this country, which is a reckoning with institutional racism, is something else that could be as impactful as a war or a bad economy. And I think that's very much a possibility. The parallels to 1968, I'm old enough to remember that election. I was pretty young, but my parents were really into politics, so I remember it. You can be in a liberal bubble and think like, there's no way Richard Nixon's going to get elected here because everyone thinks it's terrible what's going on. And there's a centrist candidate, Hubert Humphrey. There was violence in the streets. And lo and behold, Richard Nixon won because a lot of white people living in the suburbs were scared. And, so there's some parallels that could happen this time around or not. It's very dangerous to look at something like that and say it's going to repeat itself because it might not. I think there's a lot of white people who are also extremely distraught with Donald Trump's policies as well. So all bets are off. It's a very unusual time, and Donald Trump has certainly divided this country up.
Okay, well, I'm going to get back to Andy's point on the economy, but first, Lauren, I just want to look at the fact that if we look at the diversity of the protesters in the streets, the killing of George Floyd has really enraged all races and ethnicities, including white America. Why do you think this case resonates so much compared to other cases of African Americans killed in the U.S.?
I think there are you have to kind of look at this moment in totality. There's so much going on in our country. There's so much pain. There's so much frustration around and fear around the pandemic. And I think that, we had just gone through as a country this sort of shared sacrifice of all of us, staying inside and sacrificing economically for the good and safety of, our fellow Americans. So many of us. I mean, some people didn't want to do that, but mostly that was happening. And I do think that George Floyd's death coming, at the end of it's not the end, but it's sort of like end of kind of the phase one of, how our country was handling this pandemic is, you can't separate that. There's so much frustration and fear, and you attach George Floyd to it, and I think the Black community, which has been furious about these issues and fighting them for decades and decades and decades, I think finally, some of the rest of America is waking up to it. And as for how it affects the election, I mean, it's really far away at this point. I know it doesn't seem that far away, but so many things can happen. But I do think that for a president who's already unpopular, he's handling this, characteristically, poorly. saying the wrong things, doing the wrong things, highlighting the wrong things, and those images are going to come up throughout the rest of the election. Catcher's getting gassed so he can have his photo up with the Bible. Like that's not going away, and approval for Black Lives Matter has skyrocketed in the past 2 weeks. That might simmer down, but that's also not going away. And so, these are really important, serious points that I think are going to seriously affect Trump.
Absolutely. Andy, if we look at what's happened with the US economy, millions have filed for unemployment. Hundreds of thousands have died since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. What do you think this economy will look like in the fall?
Yeah, I mean, that last part of the question is really important, and it sort of speaks to what Lauren was just talking about. It's actually still pretty far away, and the question is how much of this will carry over in terms of those images, for instance, that she was just talking about, and the economics, which I'll get to in a second, and then how much of that is still present in the first week of November, both in terms of the anger and unrest and divisiveness and the economy, which is in bad shape. It is improving right now. It appears, although even that is a little uncertain right now, because some of the numbers that have come out when it comes to employment were not as bad as anticipated. But if you sort of scratch beneath the surface, there's some difficulty perhaps in gathering those numbers and calculating what's really going on here. And then, of course, it's tied into the fact that people are unhappy, they're not at work, and I think that also adds to people out in the streets as well. I mean, it's Black Lives Matter, but it's also the fact that people are unhappy with just the general direction of the country, which includes the economy. And inequality is tied into Black Lives Matter and coronavirus. So it's all of a piece. It's pretty clear we're not snapping back, I think, in many ways. And in fact, the coronavirus is getting worse in 20 plus states right now. And so that's not going to help the economy of those states. It's just this huge wild card. I hate to sound equivocal, but it's very, very difficult to predict right now.
Absolutely. Now, Steve, to Andy's point, economic inequalities have been magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Just to look ahead here for a moment, do you think this current crisis gives the next president an opportunity to rebuild the US economy in a way that is more equitable for all?
Well, I do if there's big thinking involved. I mean, we also have to remember that wherever the stock market is not necessarily a sign of where the economic health of Americans are. You've got upwards of 44 million on the official count of unemployed. Maybe half of those will come back to work in the relative next couple of quarters if there's a reasonable recovery. But I think how Andy laid out as this being a wild card is right. So you're going to have somewhere of 20 million or so people in the best of circumstances who continue to be unemployed, who were actively employed just a few months ago. And so that's before you get to the underlying inequality that was there before this hit. And I think a lot of what we've been seeing about Black Lives Matter and the whole question of who is demeaned in this American society was there before. So yes, aggravated, yes, terrible, and yes, the next president of the United States should think in terms, as happened during the Great Depression with the Works Progress Administration. People like former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz have out there been promoting ideas like an energy jobs coalition of looking at how to put millions of Americans to work on sustainable energy platforms and new infrastructure commitments, and thinking about a way to tie the needs of a future country to the employment needs now. But that's going to require will and vision. Neither of those have I seen much of from candidly, even from Joe Biden's campaign promises. But at least that's an opportunity to rewrite the social contract. And very often after a large-scale crisis of this sort in American history, we have come back to do those things. But we're in a very different time. and we may not have the kinds of leaders that America had in its past.
All right, I'm going to get back to Joe Biden in just a moment, but Lauren, I just want to quickly ask you, do you think this is a tipping point for undecided voters and for those who don't vote to vote this time around? There's been a lot of talk, for example, about how many young people we're seeing out in the streets protesting.
Yeah, it's always tough to tell. As I said, we have months and months to go before the election, and I think that people are very animated and energized and, feel like they're being heard. Changes are happening. The Minneapolis police department is getting disbanded. Like, actual tangible change is happening as a result of these protests. But I think that a lot of it depends on how much this stays at the front of the conversation, what happens when the general starts in earnest, what the narratives are between Joe Biden and Trump. It's hard to gauge at this point.
Okay, well, if we look at Joe Biden for a moment, the Democratic presidential nominee, he's faced a unique set of circumstances with his campaign. He's had to run his entire campaign virtually online. How much do you think it matters that Joe Biden isn't getting enough face time, if you will, the way the president has in the news media? Steve?
I think that's the wrong way to think about it. I mean, I think Joe Biden honestly has been doing better, in controlling his message, and he has been getting out some. But this notion that we have that campaigns have to happen in an analog way, with a candidate going out and doing the handshake line all around the nation, we've just gone. We used to talk about it. I mean, Andy and I've talked about this before, about how the world was becoming more digital. But let's be honest, it wasn't until coronavirus hit. Now you've got everyone engaged with each other, families, companies, social groups online, and the scale at which you do outreach today online is very different than we've seen before. I don't want to be a kind of Zoom triumphalist in all of this, but Joe Biden is able to do so much more from his basement than he could in a 10-state run today. That doesn't necessarily mean that I know how that is going to deteriorate some of his appeal across the board. But I think we need to change our frame and be open to the fact that these platforms change the edge that a campaign and a candidate can bring. That's very different than the analog way that they used to do politics.
Okay, Andy, if we look at the past 3.5 years, it's been argued that Donald Trump has single-handedly been able to change this media landscape, and with this cause and effect. When he talks, markets move. So how do you think he's been able to do this so effectively?
It's really remarkable. And, who would have thunk it, right? This real estate mogul from New York, maybe successful, maybe not, was able to sort of transform himself into the most important media figure on the planet. And, he honed his skills becoming a reality TV star in The Apprentice and learned how to do that. Then he took over Twitter and learned how to manage that better than anyone and dominate that particular media and use it very, very effectively. He also uses rallies incredibly effectively. He also uses television and has certain networks like Fox wrapped around his finger. So there's that. New networks have been created to promote his vision of America, like One America. So he's really transformed media in a way that almost no one else has. It's really stunning. And I think that the rest of us in media are sort of scrambling to keep up. Like, and at first it was like, hey, he's lying. Oh, but we can't really say it's a lie because he's the president. Well, there's what he said, and then there's something, we did the false equivalency thing, and now people are saying he's just lying. But we still haven't grappled with the fact that he, basically, controls Twitter, controls Fox. I mean, I'm only slightly overstating the case, but I think we're just playing catch up with the president.
Okay, well, Lauren, according to a Pew Research Center study, only half of Americans feel their media is fair and accurate. So how would you assess the media's job of covering the president?
I think that you get into mistakes of, what Andy was saying, early on with trying to apply the same old rules to Donald Trump. They don't exist. I mean, he's basically burned them to the ground. And I don't think that I don't think it is smart for us as the media to be afraid of audiences and readers, not trusting us when we tell the truth. But I think that the thing that we can work on always is, being generous and open and providing as much context as we can, and not, being sensationalistic with the stories that we do. But the truth is the truth. And, there can be a million surveys about it, but this is what we have to do is tell it.
Steve, I know you and I have spoken about responsible journalism previously. Do you think journalists have been able to effectively navigate the challenges that this era of fake news and social media have brought forth?
I do. I mean, I think that most journalists are fact-based, empirical, do their job, and resist the urge for the media to become the subject of the story. Donald Trump loves to tweak us, loves to demean people in the media, loves to label folks as fake news, and there's a whole industry covering that right now, which I find a distraction from covering the President of the United States and the policy choices and political choices they make. So I think it's very important to recognize that most journalists are doing their job in the right way and doing fact-based, objectively distant commentary and journalism, even though the president may want to pick a fight otherwise. But so I don't like the journalism out there that begins to look at how the president is treating the media, because I find it irrelevant to the bigger story. But if you look overwhelmingly, I think journalism continues to do a good job of doing its job.
Okay, we're just coming to a close here shortly, but I just want to ask really quickly about the president's base. As we all know, the president has been very successful of maintaining a very loyal base, but given how tumultuous the past few weeks and few months have become, do you think that this has the potential to weaken any part of his base? Andy?
At first for a long time, I should say, everyone said that this base cannot be moved, right? That it's the 30 or whatever %, and he can, as the president himself said, shoot someone on Fifth Avenue. So two things. First of all, that can be the case and Joe Biden can still win, of course. I mean, because there's the other 60 to 70%. And number two, I actually think there is some erosion, and I'm starting to see it. I have some friends who were Republicans living in New Hampshire who said they're done. I'm up in Maine, and I saw a video of some people up here who came out of a very rural part of the state, which has very strong support for Donald Trump, and said that they posted a video that went viral, ripping down racist signs and saying that Black Lives Matter and that they care. And these guys are like total Mainers up there, and it was actually really kind of cool to see. So there may be some erosion, but it may not matter one way or the other. Joe Biden has to get the other part of the country.
Lauren, what does real change look like in the media and in politics beyond the rhetoric of saying the right things?
Well, something really remarkable has been happening in the media in the past couple weeks. I mean, it's actually been happening for years, but I think it's being out in the open in the past few weeks, which is that Black journalists and journalists of color in mainstream newsrooms are stepping up, being very brave, and speaking their minds about sort of traditional concept of objectivity and neutrality in the media, and what that means for them as Black journalists, and how they feel that their voices are being stifled in these big newsrooms. And I think that there's lots of ways to look at change, and I think one of the ways that the media has traditionally underserved our audiences and our readers has been to not allow journalists to bring their full selves to the reporting of the news. And I think that is shown through in what we have put out there. And I think that this is a real change that can happen. I think some people won't like it, but I think that it is going to be meaningful, create a meaningful difference in the quality and the type of stories that people are seeing.
Well, none of us could have foreseen the circumstances that have engulfed American politics, the economy, society. Steve, what do you think Americans are hoping for in the lead up to this election? Normalcy or change?
I don't think that it's necessarily a clear choice between normalcy and change. I think Americans want to see a return to a healthier country. I don't think we can continue as we were. Racism has been baked into the United States from the very beginning, and we may be at an inflection point, a hinge point, where we begin to make amends for some of that and begin to embrace people in a way that we haven't seen before. I don't mean to sound kumbaya or too optimistic here, because it's going to require a fight. I think Lauren's absolutely right. A lot of people will not like it, but it's going to be uncomfortable. There are winners and losers with what's coming ahead. And what is happening right now is the tilt is changing to some of those people who have been disempowered to bring them in, and they're going to have allies. And I think America wants to know that that process is ultimately going to lead to a greater nation, not to a lesser nation, and a divided nation, which they have right now. So that's neither normalcy, nor is it change in the way we've thought about it before. It's a more genuinely inclusive country, and that means economically, that means across races, it means ending the fact that there are zip codes in the greater Baltimore area where people have life expectancies of more than 20 years difference. That's the kind of thing that's coming up right now, and we have to look at.
Well, on that note, Steve, Lauren, Andy, thank you very much for joining us here at Collision from Home.